Good morning, photographers, and welcome back to my channel. Now, today what I'm going to be talking about is why I chose not to get a Canon R7. Now, hear me out on this. I'm not saying that it's a bad camera in any way. In fact, I do think that it's the best APS-C sensor camera that you can get in Canon's lineup right now. So I think it's an amazing camera, but myself, I didn't think that it made sense to get one. Now, I was lucky enough that my local camera store, the Brick, New Jersey camera store, had 3 R7 kits come in. He called me up as soon as they came in, so I had the chance to actually get a Canon R7, and I was about to go get it, and then all of these questions start racing through my head. I'm like, Jesse, do you really need a Canon R7? You have an R6, you also have an RP, you basically transferred over to full frame to get the higher ISO performance. And that's the thing, like I started running through all of these questions and I'm thinking, what advantages am I going to get if I switch over to getting an R7 and getting rid of my RP? There are some big advantages there. The dual pixel 1 autofocus on my RP just gets blown away by the dual pixel 2 autofocus on the R7. The R7 has a lot of really great specs, and on paper, it gets you really, really excited. You know, if you're a wildlife photographer like me, you get that 1.6 reach factor, so that's gonna help you get more zoom on your telephoto lenses, and that's really good for wildlife. But like I said, I own a Canon R6. Now, yes, the reach is an advantage when it comes to wildlife, but unfortunately, I think that's really the only advantage that the R7 has over the R6. Now, hear me out. There are other things there, but Canon has this way of kind of kneecapping features, and it makes them kind of not as useful as you would have thought they would be. Now, one of the big things is you've got a 32 megapixel sensor on a Canon R7. Now, that sounds awesome because, wow, now I'm going to be able to crop significantly more than, say, like my 20 megapixel sensor on my R6. And that is true. And again, I have experience with both of these guys. I've been using both of these cameras for about a month now. And the one thing that jumps out at me, while yes, I can crop more, significantly more, and have sharp shots with the R7 and the 32 megapixel sensor versus the 20 megapixel sensor on my R6, but it's not as big of a difference as you might think. What I've noticed is that it really comes down to getting the tack sharp focus. If you get a picture very, very sharp, and very well in focus, you can actually crop even on a 20 megapixel sensor pretty well. I'm not saying there isn't a difference there. You definitely can crop more on a 32 megapixel sensor, but it's not as big of a difference as you might think. And I'm able to crop pretty significantly on a 20 megapixel sensor, so I've been decently happy there. The other thing that the 32 megapixel sensor really kind of presents is you're getting an even slower readout speed than the R6 20 megapixel sensor. And what that does is it really kneecaps the electronic shutter mode. And that's where you get the really high burst rates, right? You're gonna get 30 frames a second burst rates with an R7, and that gets people really, really excited. But unfortunately, it's kneecapped by the slow readout speeds from that sensor, and that introduces a ton of rolling shutter. Now, rolling shutter also presents itself on the R6 in electronic mode, but the thing is it's less significant. I don't notice it almost ever. I'm not saying it never happens. Yes, if I shoot something really fast, like say a hummingbird, and I do get some curvature in the wings sometimes, but a lot of times, a lot of those shots don't present any rolling shutter with my R6. And what you will notice is that the rolling shutter is much more prevalent, even in backgrounds if you're panning, like say a bird in flight with the R7. And for that reason, I wouldn't want to use the electronic shutter with the R7. So unfortunately, that's one bad thing. The other thing is obviously it's an APS-C sensor. So while you do get the increased crop factor and you get more reach for wildlife, you are still getting a significant amount more noise when you go into higher ISOs. Now with the R7, I find ISO 6400, ISO 8000, those are noisy files at that point, but they're usable. If you're using something like Topaz Labs Denoise AI, you're going to be able to use images at those ISOs. You're probably going to be able to use images at higher than those ISOs if you really want to. The thing is, I notice that the noise that comes from the R6, while there still is noise at really high ISOs, it cleans up better using the Denoise AI software, and you don't lose as much detail. So there's still a significant difference in the quality of the images that you're going to get. at ISO values that are that high versus the R6. And like I said, the other thing is the burst rates that you're getting from the R7 that make you really get excited about it, they're hindered. You're really only going to get the 15 because you're going to feel like you need to use the mechanical shutter more often than the electronic shutter. Where the R6, I pretty much exclusively shoot wildlife at 20 frames per second in my electronic shutter. And like I said, yes, rolling shutter does present itself, but it's much less significant than on the R7. The buffering coming from the Canon R7 is significantly worse than the Canon R6. Now, the Canon R6, I almost never run into my buffer limit. I feel like I can shoot almost forever. It never really hinders me. With the R7, you can fill that buffer like almost instantaneously, even at the 15 frames per second. So that was a really unfortunate thing. So when I sat there and I thought about it, and I said, Jesse, do you really need an R7? Are you going to spend $2,000? And what are you going to get? Now, if it was replacing my RP, yes, I'm getting dual pixel 2 autofocus. I'm getting C-Log 3, 4K, 10-bit footage. All of these things were the reasons they were kind of pulling me towards that R7. But the thing about it is, I have all of those features in my R6. And not only do I have all those features in my R6, but they're actually better than the R7. The ISO performance out of the sensor is better. The files that come out of it are better. I just overall don't think that the R7 holds up to my R6. So having an R6, and the thing is, yes, there is still an advantage there when it comes to wildlife because of the crop factor. But when you're someone like me who doesn't have unlimited funds, I really have to take into account, is it worth the $2,000 that I'm about to put out? And when I thought about that, the answer to me was really no, because I really have all of these features in my R6. Not only do I have those features, but I think they're significantly better than on the R7. Now, again, please don't think that I'm trying to down on the R7. I do think it's an amazing camera. And if you're somebody who's using one of Canon's older APS-C cameras, whether that be something like a 90D or an M6 Mark II, I think that it would make a lot of sense for you to upgrade to the new Canon R7 because you're taking advantage of, one, that RF mount. The RF mount is huge because the RF lenses are amazing and they perform much better than the older EF lenses. And they're only going to get better as they start producing more and more lenses. You're also getting the advantage of the new dual pixel 2 autofocus. And speaking of the autofocus, that's another thing that I want to talk about. I think a lot of people got really excited because they saw that Canon said that the autofocus was inherited from the Canon EOS R3. And I think a lot of people took that to mean that the autofocus was going to be better on the R7 than it was on the R5 and the R6. Now, my experience using both of those cameras, using both of the same lenses, the exact same setups, is that the autofocus struggles more on the R7 than it does on my R6. Now, I haven't done crazy scientific tests, but I have used both of these camera bodies back and forth, and I do notice that the autofocus system is more reliable on my R6. Whether that comes down to the fact that I'm just more used to my R6, or maybe I'm being a little bit biased, I don't know, but being completely honest with you guys, I can say that I do feel that the R6 autofocus is a little bit more reliable than the R7, and I've seen a couple of other reviewers actually say that they felt the same way. So while they do inherit the R3 autofocus in the R7 from the Canon EOS R3, I think what Canon really meant there was that you're getting the dual pixel 2 autofocus. You're getting the subject tracking from that autofocus system. But I don't think that that means that it's on the level of the R5, the R6, or the R3. I even saw somebody post something saying that it was due to the fact that the full frame sensors have better dynamic range and better high ISO performance, and therefore them being the same autofocus systems, you're going to see the autofocus system struggle more significantly with an R7 when it gets pushed into a situation where you might need more dynamic range or you might need higher ISO values to get the shot exposed correctly, in which case the sensor will struggle a little more because it'll be noisier or have slightly less dynamic range, which will make it a little bit harder for the autofocus to work. Again, I'm not saying that this is exactly how it works. This is just kind of my opinion, but based on using both of these cameras, I do not think that the autofocus in the R7 is as good as my Canon R6. Now, it's very, very close. It's essentially the same thing, but I do prefer the autofocus on my R6. I just wanted to share all of these thoughts with you guys because I thought this was worth knowing, because maybe you're in the same situation as me where you have an R6 and you're thinking about getting an R7, but you're not sure if you should or not. And overall, I think there's this hype factor to it, right? Like when the camera first came out, when I was reading all the specs and I'm learning all these things about the Canon R7, I was like, I'm getting an R7 hands down. Because I was lucky enough that my friend got the R7 day one, and I've been able to play with it, pretty much daily since then. The hype factor kind of wore off. I'm using it now. I'm not super excited about it, like something that I've never got my hands on. So knowing all of these things and having some of that hype factor wear off a little bit, I just think that these are good things to know if you are going to purchase this camera. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad camera in any way. In fact, what I'm going to tell you is it is the best APS-C sensor camera in Canon's lineup. And like I said, if you're using one of the older APS-C sensor cameras, it makes a lot of sense to upgrade to this. It's a phenomenal wildlife camera. I just think if you're someone like me who owns an R6 or an R5, really, the only thing that it excels in over those cameras is really that 1.6 crop factor. Anyway, guys, if this helped you out a little bit, think about going below, subscribing, clicking that notification bell, and I'll see you on my next video.